The Prime Minister of Hungary, Orbán,
Orban, yeah.
he has said that NATO now needs to start pushing for peace. Many of the top nations have balked at his comments. Do you think it's because these NATO leaders believe that going for peace would be seen as weakness, or worse, as a loss? Or what is the reason to keep pushing at this point?
I think the leadership in Paris, Berlin, and London, as examples, is at least as remote from reality as the Biden administration is. These are, this is your globalist elite, the people that believe in a world that doesn't exist. They think they're fighting Russia because Russia is a nationalist state. They have a national identity, a national language, a national culture. Ergo, we have to destroy it. Remember, these are the people that have been inviting millions from the Middle East and Africa into Europe. They have been welcoming every single potential danger to their society as a returning faith, as something good. In other words, they want to do to Russia what they've already done to Europe, which is severely weaken the place. Look at the economic policies, catastrophic. The Germans just shut down their last nuclear power plant. Well, no matter how much you may not like nuclear power, before you shut all of your plants down, you should have some alternative that works. No, they're shutting everything down, and the alternatives don't work. I mean, if you think you're going to survive on wind turbines, you've lost your mind. And the lifeblood of all civilizations and successful scientific industrial development is cheap energy. You got to have it. So they've essentially robbed themselves of decades of positive growth and impoverished themselves. This is the elite that thinks it's right and refuses under any circumstances to accept anything else. So they look at what's happening and they say, well, the Russians still haven't moved much further now than they were a few months ago. In other words, the Russians control about 24% of Ukrainian territory. The Russians have never cared about the territory. They care about destroying Ukrainian forces and killing them. They want to demilitarize and, quote unquote, denazify Ukraine. Well, if the Ukrainians are coming to them repeatedly in vast numbers and allowing themselves to be killed, you don't move very much. When that ends, they'll move. Maybe then these people in Western Europe will wake up. But, I kind of doubt it. I think they're going to have to be thrown out of office. And if the Europeans don't throw them out, it could be the death of Europe. These people are a catastrophe. They're a disaster. Britain is in just as much, if not more, serious trouble. So to answer your question, it's an ideological problem. In other words, if you think that you're going to extend with force of arms the LGBTQRSW whatever agenda to Russia that refuses to absorb and adopt your quote unquote new values, instead says, no, we're an Orthodox Christian country. We think there are two genders, men and women. And oh, by the way, we don't marry women to women and men to men. Oh, well, obviously they're committing a terrible sin. They deserve to be destroyed. This is a hopeless endeavor. That's not going to end. In fact, I think the tide of opinion and attitude is actually swinging in Russia's favor in Europe as more and more people look at the, I don't want to say catastrophic, but certainly fragile quality of their civilization and culture. Russia is pointing to it in a different direction and is going to gain, I think, a lot of momentum as a result. I think ultimately the globalists and their neocon friends, who seem to have all sorts of other personal reasons for hating Russia, are on the losing side. But again, it has to be demonstrated clearly, unambiguously, for them to admit anything. And even then, they'll probably crawl back under their rocks and wait for the next opportunity. I mean, I grew up during the Vietnam War. And when that thing ended, I could not conceive of any future for the United States in which we repeated the utter folly and stupidity of Vietnam. I'm sorry, but there was no vital strategic interest for the United States in Southeast Asia. In fact, a smart strategist would have stood back and said, well, if the Chinese decide to invade the place, that could be good. They'll overreach. This is what people don't understand. If you go back through history and you look at all the sort of great men of history, whether they're bad or good, doesn't matter. Inevitably, the problem you have is that everybody overreaches. The French overreached, the Spaniards overreached, the British ultimately overreached. We are overreaching. Everyone overreaches. Remember, Einstein said he defined genius as knowing when to stop. Einstein was right. These people don't get it. They don't know when to stop. So it's going to come back to haunt them. It's just a matter of time. And I think the economics at home, and I'm sure you've had other people on, but people really need to listen to this James Rickards. He's absolutely spot on. He's not the only one. There are other sober-minded people out there. The only difference I have with the cash and gold crowd is that I think Bitcoin and digital currency is going to eventually move in and become an enormously important store of value. I don't think it's a temporary phenomenon at all. I think it's a very attractive future for those of us who believe in freedom, because if you want to be free, then you want to be out from underneath the banks.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of money, I asked this to Colonel Tony Schaefer because I've had so many people ask me, why does the United States military budget, why is it over $800 billion? Where does that money go? If we're so far behind on equipment and munitions and things like that, is it just all of the military bases spread across the globe, or where does $800 billion go?
Well, it's actually more than 800 billion now, as you know. And in fact, if you go into the black budget and intelligence, you're way over $1 trillion. And I've always said it's a mistake to look at the defense budget in isolation from the others. There are several things that need to be understood. For a very long time, certainly beginning in the 1960s, Americans were persuaded that if you spent a lot of money on defense, you got lots of defense. Now, let me explain that. In other words, money in equals capability out. That's never been true. All through the 20s and the early 30s, really up until about 1938, the British and the French grossly outspent the Germans. German defense spending did not really begin to rise precipitously until 1938, 39, in the run-up to the war in France and Britain. So you can spend lots of money and get not very much for your investment. And that's a big problem for us. Why? Well, you've got a lot of people on the Hill that think their job is one and only one thing: spend money. If I were to walk you around the House of Representatives in particular, and I think to a large extent the Senate as well, everybody would tell you, listen, you got to understand something. Our job here is to spend money. That's our job. If we don't spend money, then we don't have a job. Well, that's also tied to re-election and sustaining investments in places and things that benefit your constituents. Also involves spending heavily to benefit your donors. And I like to say that we really have donor government now. You go back to Ralph Nader all through the 90s, he was trying to tell everybody, Washington's occupied territory, the corporations own everything. Well, I would say right now, the donors govern your country. You have open borders. Is that because we all voted on a referendum to open our borders and admit anybody who wants to come in? Of course not. But donors want to do that. Some of those people are involved with the Chamber of Commerce. Some of those are in industries. They want cheap labor. Some of it has to do with corruption and the drug trade and illegal human trafficking, I'm sure, all of those things. So what I'm trying to get across is that the notion that you're spending explicitly for a military capability is false. And here's something else that most viewers just don't get. They don't understand this. We have right now on active duty 44 4-stars, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine. 44 for a force of less than 1.1 million. And by the way, as you all know, we're having trouble recruiting and have had it for quite a while. So during World War II, we had 12.2 million men in uniform at the height of the war. And when we were at 12.2 million, we had 7 4-stars. I mean, I can name them for you: Marshall, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Arnold, King, Nimitz, and I think King, Nimitz, and Leahy. Those 7. That's it. Now, how could we possibly have fought a major war successfully without the help of all those dozens of 4-stars that we now have? Well, look, this is part of the rot, the corruption, the waste. The whole department is a catastrophe. You can't even audit it. You know, you read the recent headline, oh, we found $3 billion that we can ship to Ukraine. Well, the $3 billion aren't going to Ukraine. Some cash will go over there. That does, because you got to pay the government, pay the Ukrainian army, pay for those kinds of things. But most of it just goes from Congress, at least on paper, to the Department of Defense. And that, of course, goes through the Treasury. And then from the Department of Defense, it's recycled back into the defense industries and various contractors. Then it shows up again in the form of donations to political action committees and re-election campaigns and so forth on the Hill. If you want to know why people come to Washington as sort of average middle-class people, and then 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later come out as multimillionaires, there's a reason. We did not create a government that was designed to enrich the people that participate in it. Far from it, but that's what we've got. So you can make a lot of money in Washington, D.C. in government if you're on the right subcommittee, if you have the right donors, if you do the right things. How many times have you heard, well, I'm sorry, I'd like to vote for what you want me to vote for, but I can't do it. Well, why can't you do it? Well, I won't get reelected. Well, what do you mean you won't be reelected? Well, my donors will support my opponent because I have taken a position they don't like and I'll be replaced. That's a hell of a government. You know, it really is. It's a marvelous invention that doesn't make any sense. So our 18th century construct from the 1780s really doesn't work. That's the other revelation that has not yet sunk in. Everybody talks about, oh, the Constitution. Let me tell you, the Bill of Rights is vastly more important. The mechanics of government that we're using today were fine in the late 1700s and probably up until the Civil War. But since then, they've made no sense. I mean, just look at your 50-state construct. Boy, isn't it helpful to have all those states that all have these powers and authorities that can obstruct, stop, whatever you want to do if it's important? In other words, would we be better off with a nation of, say, 5 regions and consolidate a lot of that government and reduce it in size? I mean, there are a lot of things that have to be done, but nothing is going to happen, I think, until there's an enormous economic downturn and a financial crisis. Then we'll begin to see evidence for that. And that goes for foreign policy and domestic policy. You shouldn't see them as totally distinct from each other, because they're not.
Yeah. A hurting wallet makes people behave differently. There's all this talk about central bank digital currency and Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin. I don't know that the government really wants Bitcoin to take off because it would force them to be honest. I don't think we would be able to have these dark pools of military money and all of this, because there would be a track record of where that money is going in Washington, D.C. And I'm guessing that terrifies them.
Oh, listen, I think you're 100% spot on. By the way, I remember when this whole business got started with the so-called volunteer armed forces. I never considered myself a volunteer. I'm a professional soldier. And so I really dislike the notion of being some volunteer, as though I just show up when there's a fire and otherwise I go about my business. I think the alternative is as follows. The Bitcoin and the digital currency is a promise of freedom from government intrusion, control, and influence. And that influence is obviously linked to the banking system, the financial system. I'm for almost anything that gets the government out of my life as much as possible. But there's another thing. When this volunteer armed forces got started, people said privately, this is a good thing. because now we can do whatever we want with the armed forces. Nobody will pay any attention because we don't have a draft. Now, I have never been a big advocate for the draft in the past. That may have to change in the future. I don't know, but I've never liked it. And I saw the tail end of the draft and the people that were drafted, and they were very miserable and unhappy. And I saw what began to be the foundation for a professional force in the 80s. And that got much better. It was still not, strictly speaking, a real professional force. The most professional people, though, were at the lowest levels. The least professional were at the top. That's still the case, I think, because there's really no compulsion to study your profession. Nobody cares about that. And if you think any of the people that are running the show right now in uniform in the Department of Defense are there because they're just, the best possible soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines that you could ever have, you've lost your mind. They're there because they've been put through a political ringer, certainly over the last 30 years, especially over the last 21, 22. Anyone who did not willingly conform, anyone who did not mindlessly embrace whatever dumb ideas and policies came their way, was invited to leave. And people say, well, that's civilian control of the military. No, that's civilian destruction of the military. There's a big difference. Anyone who understands the military understands there are limits to influence on both sides, military and civilian. And what is properly the purview of professional soldiers is not necessarily something for debate by members of the Senate and the House who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. You might just as well convene a committee on the Hill to discuss the manufacture of microcircuitry and ask them to comment on, how we should approach it and how much money should be invested. They don't know. We have lots of people that don't know, but they make these decisions and influence outcomes. We can't go on like this. So this whole governmental structure, I think, is in trouble. And maybe if there's anything good happening right now, maybe it'll turn us down a different road so that we can reassess the way we do business. But right now, the biggest danger I see is that this crowd in Washington does not understand how dangerous the situation with Russia really is. They just don't. And they continue to grossly underestimate the Russian government, its leadership, and the Russian people. You can't do that. And in the meantime, they are on the bridge of the financial economic version of the Titanic. And their view is the iceberg that we hit back there a few kilometers ago, minor consideration, don't worry about it. And I don't think that they're going to wise up until the waves lap over the decks and reach the bridge.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I appreciate all the insight that you bring to these stories, the news, all of your decades of experience. Thank you so much again for coming on today's show.
Sure. Thank you, Steve.